I am back once again, yet again with another Nikon, this time with a new lens. This is the 85mm f2, one I've mentioned before, and this is one that I personally like. It's probably not my absolute favorite lens in the entire lineup, but it ranks up there in probably the top 2 or 3. I don't know exactly where I'd place it, but it is a really nice lens. This is a beautiful portrait lens. It has a very dramatic bokeh effect and a very dramatic depth of field. It can produce very sharp images when properly focused. The downside is it is kind of tough to focus. And the setup is pretty much how, I use it pretty much how you see it right now. I always use the 85mm lens on the Nikon SP because, as I've said before, the Nikon SP has 85mm frame lines, and for some reason it is the only Nikon camera to have 85mm frame lines. When I bought the lens, it did include this little tunnel viewfinder, and I mean, it's kind of neat. You just set it right up here on the top, and you got a little viewfinder. It has the little thing where you adjust the knob on the back for distance, and it gives you a parallax correction. That's kind of neat, but I don't really like using these external viewfinders on telephoto lenses. I feel like there's a little bit too much motion trying to go from the primary viewfinder and focus to this one up here and actually compose the image, and a little trouble getting that off. But I find it to be just a little bit inconvenient. I don't mind it as much with wider angle lenses like a 28 or even a 35 per se. But when you get up to like the 85s, and especially something more like a 105 or 135, I just feel like it's something that's probably going to cause you to lose about as much accuracy as you gain. I'm sure a lot of people would say that's not very accurate, but I personally am not a big fan of the tunnel viewfinders for telephoto lenses or longer than average lenses. That's just my 2 cents, and I would personally suggest that if you do want to shoot the Nikon 85mm lens or 8.5 centimeter lens as your primary lens, I would say spend the extra money and invest in an SP, because having those frame lines inside the primary viewfinder is very useful. It just makes it so much faster and easier to shoot. And it's just one less thing to carry, because then instead of having a little finder mounted on top of your camera, you can mount a light meter. Or, I mean, that's all I would really mount. But that is something that I think most people are going to need. A nice little hot shoe mounted meter, and I much prefer the hot shoe mounted ones to the handheld ones. Again, just personal preference. I'm sure some people will say the handheld ones are more accurate or have more utility, and that's generally true, but these are small, they're convenient, and they're usually pretty cheap. You can see I have another video on this particular meter. If you want to see that, that's the V201X video. I think it's the V201X versus the Sekonic L208 video that I put out a while ago. But let's get back to the lens. As I said, I pretty much always shoot it on the SP. I think this lens pairs really well with something wider like a 35 or a 28. I've noticed that a lot of older kits and professionals seem to really favor this 85mm lens. A lot of them were made in a Leica screw mount, and apparently they were very popular on Leicas, and this exact same lens was just slightly redesigned and rebranded, and it was actually sold with a lot of early Canon cameras. So if you have an old Canon 85mm lens, it's actually, there's about a 90% chance it's Nikon. I think there are some later models they made that are a little bigger and have a faster aperture that are Canon built and not Nikon built, but I find that kind of interesting that a lot of the early Canon lenses were actually Nikon lenses. So back to this lens. It has a fast aperture of f2, which is pretty good for a 85mm lens. Even by modern standards, most of them really only go up to f1.8. I've seen a few 1.4s and a couple of 1.2s, but they're kind of rare and they usually get really expensive. And I think with this focal length, f2 is probably about as wide open as you really want it, because if you go much more wide open than that, you're going to have a hard time focusing. And it's interesting because I actually have an adapter where I can mount these old Nikon lenses on my Sony A7, and a friend of mine has the 85mm f1.8 Sony G Master lens. And one day I compared these two lenses, shooting both of them at f2 and manually focusing both of them using focus peaking on the camera. And I thought the results I got from this lens were extremely comparable to the Sony 85mm f1.8 G Master. Granted, the G Master, of course, does have autofocus, which is going to be a lot more convenient to use, but that's a very expensive lens. When it came out, it cost over $3,000, and even now it still costs quite a bit. I think it's still over $2,000. So when you compare that to a lens like this that normally runs around, I think, $250 to $300, and that's of course with the chrome version. There is a much rarer black version that usually goes up to $600 or $800, but when you compare the price point and also just consider the age of this lens, that's actually very good, I think. So I've had this lens for a while. This is one of the earlier lenses I bought. It's probably about the 4th Nikon lens I've had, so I've had it for a while. And the one issue I've had with it is that, of course, when I shoot with it, I often shoot a few shots on this lens, swap out to another lens, and then when I'm looking at the roll, I can't really tell which is which. So I have a few images that I think I shot with this lens that are really good, but thinking back, I'm not 100% sure they were shot with this lens and not maybe the 105 f2.5, because I know I've used that here and there. And in some instances, I'm not even sure if it's this lens or a 50mm, because the focal lengths are not hugely different, and when you're just kind of looking at photos, it's actually really hard to tell, as I've said before. But I have a roll I shot specifically on this lens, the entire roll, not that long ago when I developed it, and they came out good. I'm going to include some of those images at the end of this video just to give you an idea of what they look like. They will all be black and white, but I think I got a few good images off that roll. I shot a roll a while ago on this lens, and it came out really bad. The film had a lot of scratches, so I was really disappointed because it looked like there would have been a couple of really good shots if not for that. But this is a good lens. My one big complaint about this lens, well, I guess I kind of have two, one big one and one smaller one. I think my big one is that this lens is very unforgiving in the focus department, especially when you use it wide open at f2. It seems to have a very narrow field of focus, and it's very easy to get images that are a little bit out of focus, and it's not something that I always get, but I've noticed, especially with like portrait work, I found it to be kind of difficult to accurately focus this lens and to do it consistently. So I almost always take a couple of shots and just kind of play with the focus a little bit to make sure I have it as accurate as possible. And even then, I don't always get the perfect results I'm looking for. But in many ways, that's just kind of the peril of working with old gear and shooting on film. You don't really know what you have until you've developed it and scanned it, or you're looking at it in the dark room. So for better or for worse, it is what it is. The other small complaint I have about this lens is one I've kind of mentioned before, but I haven't harped on too much. When you have these older lenses, the minimum focusing distance is not that great. On most of the Nikons, it is somewhere around 3 feet. But the longer the lens gets, the longer that minimum focusing distance gets. And on this 85, it is actually 3.5 feet, which of course isn't really that big of a difference, 3 feet to 3.5 feet. But I was never too pleased with the 3 foot distance to begin with. So adding an extra half foot is not something I really appreciate, but it is something I have to deal with. It's not always something that comes into issue, but it has come into issue a few times where I've wanted to shoot something pretty close with this lens, and I realized that I'm kind of at about 3 feet when I need to back off just a little bit, just a few inches, so I can get that, that actual focus and kind of frame it properly. It's really more focus than framing. It's all focus, but that is one thing I found to be a little bit frustrating, is that it is it would be nice if it focused closer, and it's easy to say that, and obviously there's nothing I can do about it. This camera and lens were made a long time ago. They were discontinued a long time ago, so it's kind of a null point. Again, just another little issue you might have dealing with older camera gear, that it's very common that older lenses don't focus very close, and this is a prime example of it. Overall, I really do like this lens. I think it has a very nice bokeh quality, nice depth of field. It's pretty fast, f2 at 85, so you can use it in darker scenarios if you want. It works great on the SP. It's a little bit heavy, especially on the front of these cameras, but I don't generally find that to be a huge issue. You know, you got the focusing ring right here at the front that clicks around. It is right next to the focusing ring and the aperture ring, I mean, right next to each other, and you would think that might be an issue and I might accidentally turn the aperture ring when I mean to turn the focusing ring, but there's something about it. The focusing ring seems to stick up a little bit higher, and the aperture ring is clicked, so it does click into place. And I've never really found that to be an issue. Looking at it, that's something you would think would be an issue, but I've never personally had any problems with that. I'm sure there are people out there who have had that issue and have become really frustrated with it, but for me personally, I've never had an issue with that. It does use a very odd filter size. I want to say it's something like 46 or 47 millimeters. And you can almost never find those filters. The one bright side is if you have the actual lens hood, which I have over here, it has this strange mechanism where it kind of opens up, and you can put an old Series 7 filter. You can kind of drop it in there and screw this back on, and you'll have a filter kind of stuck in your lens hood. It's an odd mechanism, but it was something that was pretty common at the time. And even the lens hood itself is pretty odd, because if you flip it over, it has this cap. It is actually the lens cap for the lens, and you pop it off, you take off this rear screw-on cap, and then you screw the lens hood onto the lens, which is kind of an odd process. I don't know of too many lenses that did that. I know some of the other Nikons, like the old 135mm lenses, were built like this. I think the 85 f1.5 had a very similar hood, and I think a couple of other brands briefly used a style like this, but it was pretty rare, so it's kind of an odd thing to see. I don't really find it to be that big of a deal. When I shoot with the camera, or the camera and lens, I almost never use the lens hood. I probably should, but I don't. So those little things like that are interesting to note, but don't really affect me, and I don't think they'll affect most people. I think that's pretty much it for this lens. It's a lens I like. It's probably not my favorite lens, like I said, but if I was cutting down all my Nikon gear and trying to get it to a pretty basic set with like 1 or 2 cameras and like 2 to 4 lenses, this would definitely be one of the top contenders. And I might actually end up doing that in the future because I have a lot of this gear, and I do enjoy it, but I'm kind of running out of room, and I don't use a lot of it as frequently as I would like. And when you compare some of the cameras, the SP is just so much better than a lot of the older cameras. There's really no contest. So I'm thinking of kind of culling down my gear collection, but when I do, I think there's a good chance this lens will stay and remain part of my collection for some time to come. So hopefully that's a little bit of information right there that'll help someone who's interested in this lens, or has it, or what has you. I don't know why people watch these videos. If you have a reason for watching, leave it in the comments. I'm interested to know if people really are that interested in my ramblings. So I think I'll call it a day, and I'll post this video, have some photos coming your way, so stay tuned for that.